Harold Godwinson, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings. A central figure within the influential Godwin family, he distinguished himself through both martial skill and strategic statesmanship. Before claiming the throne, he served as the Earl of Wessex, one of the most powerful noble officers in the realm, and was effectively the chief power broker behind the king, Edward the Confessor, wielding tremendous influence over courtly politics and foreign affairs. But when Edward died in January of 1066, Harold assumed the crown with remarkable speed. His elevation occurred amid a volatile landscape of rival claims. William, the Duke of Normandy, you might know him as William the Conqueror, and Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, both contested Harold's right to rule. Over the months that followed, Harold faced the daunting challenge of defending his newly inherited kingdom against these formidable adversaries. After rallying the English forces and successfully repelling a Norwegian invasion at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in late September, Harold and his tired troops were force-marched rapidly southward to confront William the Conqueror. The climactic showdown, I'm sure you've heard of, came at the Battle of Hastings, October 14th, 1066, that singular event that would reshape the future of England. Now Harold, despite fighting with skill and courage, was slain there on the battlefield. And there, too, died the last vestige of Anglo-Saxon royal authority, clearing the path for William's victorious claim and the subsequent Norman Conquest. It was a watershed moment. Everything changed. England's culture, language, legal codes, social structures, everything. So in hindsight, Godwinson's brief reign and tragic demise marked this turning point. He symbolizes the end of the indigenous English monarchy and the dawn of the new Norman dominance, and his determined resistance, though ultimately unsuccessful, shows both the resilience of the Anglo-Saxon tradition and the magnitude of the transformations ushered in by William and his Norman successors. Welcome to the channel, everybody. Here we go, on another video, back to Anglo-Saxon England, right at the very end, the final pages of their story. But don't let that upset you, because it's quite a fascinating story. The Last King. Now, if you are new to the channel, I do encourage you to like and subscribe as we race toward the 100,000 mark. Did you click the button? Thank you in advance. Now, with that out of the way, just enjoy the video, because we begin now. So let's start by saying that Harold was born into a significant Anglo-Danish noble family. His father was the formidable Earl Godwin of Wessex, and his mother was one Gytha Thorkelsdottir. Now Gytha's lineage connected her to the powerful Scandinavian royalty. Her brother, Ulf the Earl, had wed Estrid Svensdatter, herself a member of the Danish royal house who actually lived around 1015 or 1016. Estrid was the daughter of King Sweyn Forkbeard of earlier times, who actually died in 1014, and also a sister to King Canute III, the ruler of England and Denmark. The marriage of Ulf and Estrid would produce King Sweyn II of Denmark, who ascended the throne in 1047. Now, this brings us to Godwin, Of course, Godwin, Godwin's son. Yes, you see the connection. Well, he was born around 1001, and he passed away in 1053, sprang from Sussex stock, and was likely the son of a thane named Wulfnoth. His early political loyalties shifted with the chaotic landscape of English rule. Initially, Godwin supported King Edmund Ironside, who reigned briefly in 1016. Yet by 1018 he had transferred his allegiance to the foreigner Canute, who recognized his political acuity and elevated him to the rank of Earl of Wessex. Throughout Canute's rule, Godwin maintained his position, notably emerging as one of the very few earls to remain in power until Canute's death in 1035. In the uncertain years following Canute's passing, Godwin initially championed Harthacnut over Harold Harfoot, Harthacnut being the son of Canute. Despite becoming entangled in the deadly politics at the time, his complicity in the 1036 murder of Alfred Atheling, the younger brother of the future King Edward the Confessor and half-brother to Harthacnut, was widely suspected. Well, regardless, he still managed to deftly navigate the accusations and political currents. Oh, and just before we do move on to that name, Atheling, it actually means throne-worthy. Well, by 1037, Godwin managed to change sides again, showing this uncanny ability to read the political winds. After Harold Harefoot's death in 1040, Harthacnut finally claimed the English throne. Although the earlier killing of Alfred Atheling remained a stain on Godwin's reputation, he secured a reconciliation with Harthacnut by offering a substantial gift and swearing a solemn oath of loyalty. When Harthacnut died in 1042, Godwin likely played a pivotal kingmaker role, steering the succession in favor of Edward the Confessor. His influence only grew when his daughter Edith wed the newly crowned King Edward in 1045, marking the pinnacle of his authority within the English realm. Now, this marriage was an important one indeed. It forged a close bond between the king and one of England's most powerful noble families. Godwin and Geitha, of course, had quite a few children, indicating of their prominence and the expectation of continuing their legacy. In fact, they had 6 sons: Sweyn, Harold, the title of the video, of course, Tostig, Gyrth, Leofwine, and Wulfnoth. And they had at least 3 daughters. Now, one daughter, Edith of Wessex, originally called Geitha, but later known as Ealdgyth or Edith, went on to marry King Edward the Confessor, further cementing the family's status at the court. 2 other daughters, Gunhild and Elfgifu, also formed part of this notable sibling group. Precise birth dates of all these children, of course, is really impossible to tell. We don't know. But we can estimate Harold's approximate birth year to be around 1020, and that would make him roughly 25 years old by the mid-1040s. So good at mathematics, I know. Well, this timing suggests that Harold entered adulthood just as his family was reaching the height of its political power and influence. Harold was then promoted to the Earl of East Anglia around the same time Edith married Edward the Confessor, January 23rd, 1045. And it's interesting too, because the word Earl is applied to Harold when he appears as a witness in a will that might have been made as early as 1044, but by 1045, Harold is often called Earl in documents. It becomes the norm. So it is possible that he was appointed to East Anglia in part to defend against the threat posed by King Magnus the Good of Norway. Of course, he wasn't good for everybody, I suppose. Harold might have served as the captain of some of the ships sent from his earldom to Sandwich in 1045 to engage Magnus in combat. Harold's elder brother, Sweyn, went on to become Earl in 1043, and around that time Harold was also promoted to Earl. He started dating Edith the Fair, courting this sort of thing, who seems to have been the heiress to the lands of Cambridgeshire, Suffolk, and Essex, lands that were part of Harold's new earldom. Around the same time, other comparable incidents took place, and his partnership was a type of marriage that the church did not approve of or bless. Of course. Was there somebody you forgot to ask? It was actually referred to as more Danico, which means in the Danish manner, and most lay people in England at the time would have accepted it. You see, every child born out of such a union was regarded as legitimate. Harold most certainly started the relationship to gain support in his recently acquired earldom. Harold's rise to prominence, though, was not without family turmoil and political strife. In 1047, his older brother Sweyn found himself exiled after committing a brazen crime. He had abducted the abbess of Leominster, a shocking act that not only offended the church, but alienated him from the royal court. In the aftermath of his exile, Harold and their cousin Bjorn stepped in to claim all the lands their disgraced relative had left behind, effectively carving up his state between them and strengthening their own positions. Because why not? He's not there to do anything about it. And so by 1049, Harold's political and military stature had grown to the point where he was entrusted with command of one or more ships in a fleet dispatched to assist Emperor Henry III of the Holy Roman Empire. Henry was locked in a struggle, you see, against the Count of Flanders, Baldwin V, who had chosen to rebel against imperial authority. And they don't like it when people rebel against imperial authority. During this mission, however, Sweyn unexpectedly returned to England to seek King Edward's pardon, encountering a hostile reception from Harold and Bjorn, who refused to relinquish any of the lands they had taken. Sweyn, well, he flew off the handle. He resorted to violence. Shortly after leaving the royal court, he kidnapped and murdered Bjorn, staining both his own reputation and further inflaming the family tensions. In 1051, King Edward the Confessor, influenced by rival factions, appointed a known adversary of the Godwin family to the Archbishopric of Canterbury. This powerful cleric played a key role in driving the Godwins from England, yet their exile proved to be temporary. By the following year, the Godwins had managed to muster up an army and exerted enough pressure on Edward to force their reinstatement to royal favour, and of course their former positions of power. But it wasn't all fun and games. Earl Godwin passed away in 1053, and Harold succeeded his father as the Earl of Wessex. This promotion elevated him to the rank of the most influential layman in England, surpassing all other nobles, and in fact, due to the complex sort of rankings of positions of power, he was pretty much second only to the king himself. You can imagine what that kind of power does, right? In the ensuing years, Harold, however, faced formidable challenges. In 1055, Welsh forces had laid waste to Hereford, prompting Harold to intervene militarily. He successfully pushed them back, and he showed his tactical skill and resolve in defending the English territory, and maybe taking a little bit of Welsh territory too. Of course, such loyalty and skill does not go unrewarded, and such a reward came in 1058, when Harold was granted the earldom of Hereford. Pretty good. Taking on this additional title solidified his standing as a counterweight to the rising Norman influence under Edward, who still retained many ties to Normandy after spending decades in exile there. Of course, if you want to know all about that, let's go and watch my video on Edward the Confessor. Quite interesting. Of course, we now move on to Harold's campaigns from 1062 to 1063 against Gruffydd ad Llywelyn, the King of Wales, and then marked a crucial turning point in his military career. He led multiple expeditions, and bit by bit chipped away at the power base of Gruffydd. Harold is thought to have been shipwrecked at Pontio in the year 1064, but this journey is surrounded by a bit of speculation. According to the oldest chronicles of Norman history, King Edward had already sent Robert of Jumièges, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to designate his maternal kinsman, Duke William II of Normandy, as his heir. Harold later had to be sent to swear loyalty to the king. There are many scholars, of course, who believe that this story is fraudulent. William, at the very least, seems to have believed that he had been offered the succession. Edward does, however, take some acts that are inconsistent with his having made such a commitment. Either way, his attempts to repatriate his nephew, Edward the Exile, who was also the son of King Edmund Ironside from Hungary in 1057, serve as one illustration of this. I mean, why would he try and bring him back if he had promised the throne to William? Interesting question. Well, other theories regarding Harold's journey are put forth by later Norman chroniclers. He was trying to secure the release of his family members who had been hostages since Godwin's exile many years before in 1051, according to one of these explanations. But there is another explanation that he had just been on a hunting and fishing expedition along the English coast, when an unforeseen storm forced him to cross the English Channel. Most people agreed that he was blown off course after leaving Beauchamp and landed at Pontio. He was then captured by Count Guy I of Pontio and taken as a hostage to the Count's castle in Beaurain, which is situated in what is now Le Touquet, about 25 kilometers up the river Canche from its mouth. William showed up almost immediately after and ordered Guy to give Harold to him. But you see, Harold is thought to have then accompanied William to the battlefield to fight William's enemy, Conan II, the Duke of Brittany. When William's soldiers were crossing into Brittany, Harold is reported to have saved them from quicksand. Yes, reported to. This reportedly happened after they'd entered Brittany and passed the fortified abbey of Mont Saint-Michel. They followed Conan from Dol de Bretagne to Rennes, and then on to Dinan, where he, with a lance in his hand, gave them the keys to the fortress. William then gave Harold a variety of weapons and arms in order to make a proper knight of him. Then, to bolster his claim to the English throne, Harold swore an oath to William on sacred relics, according to the Bayeux Tapestry and other Norman sources. Now, if you don't know what the Bayeux Tapestry is, I'm sure you've seen the artistic representation of the events of 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. Well, that's it. That's the Bayeux Tapestry. I think the French have it now. Maybe it's in the London Museum, I'm not too sure. If you know, let me know in the comments. Well, either way, the Normans were quick to claim that Harold had broken this alleged oath by taking the crown of England at the time of his resignation after Edward's death. Tostig then doubled the taxes that England had to pay in 1065, threatening to start a civil war at the time. Harold thus replaced his brother with Morcar and backed Northumbrian rebels against him. Tostig eventually formed an alliance with King Harold Hardrada, also known as the Hard Ruler of Norway, as a result of Harold's marriage alliance with the northern earls and the tragic division of his own family. Now, Edward the Confessor did not explain his preference for the succession after he went into a coma at the end of 1065. But we do have from the Vita Edwardi Regis, which states that he died on January 5th, 1066. He did, however, momentarily regain consciousness before passing away, and apparently thanked Harold for his protection of his widow and the kingdom. Just like the Bayeux Tapestry, which only shows Edward pointing at a man who is thought to represent Harold, the purpose of this charge is still quite unknown. Either way, when the Witan met the next day, Harold was selected as the victor. On January the 6th, he was crowned, and Westminster Abbey was probably the venue where they did that. The Bayeux Tapestry illustrates this, despite the fact that there is little but compelling evidence of the surviving period to support it. Even though later Norman sources emphasize how abrupt this coronation was, I mean, it was literally the next day. Poor old Edward the Confessor was barely even cold. It is possible that it was because all the country's nobles were simply at Westminster already for the Feast of Epiphany, and it had nothing to do with Harold jumping into the role and usurping the throne, if we can use those sorts of words. Still, it doesn't look very good. Barely 24 hours after. Well, we can't make any harsh judgments. When William heard that Harold had been crowned king in early January 1066, he was not impressed. I mean, he thought he was going to be up for the role. And barely even a day after, well, you could imagine the messenger. King William, I have some bad news and worse news. Well, give me the bad news first. Well, the bad news is Edward the Confessor is dead. Oh, that's good news. Well, what's the worst news? Well, they already have a new king. It's already been done. Of course, the only way to sort that out is a show of force. So around 700 warships and transports were built by William at Dives-sur-Mer, which is on the Norman coast. Pope Alexander II, however, formally proclaimed William the legitimate heir to the English throne, after asserting that Harold had violated an oath taken on holy relics. It didn't help that all the nobles had swarmed to his defense. Well, at first, William struggled to get people to support his cause. Harold, on the other hand, gathered his troops at the Isle of Wight in preparation for the invasion. But the invasion fleet stayed in port for nearly 7 months, probably due to the weather. Crossing the Channel, that can be a risky procedure. Harold disbanded his army and returned to London as September drew near, as his supplies were running low and everybody was all a little bit tired of it by that point. That same day, Tostig and Harold Hardrada's invasion force reached the mouth of the Tyne. And so on September 20th, 1066, the invading forces of Hardrada and Tostig triumphed at the Battle of Fulford near York, defeating the English Earls Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. In 4 days, Harold's army had reached Yorkshire, after leading them on a forced march north from London. The successful arrival surprised Harold Hardrada. On the 25th of September, Harold defeated Hardrada and Tostig at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Now, both of those were later, of course, killed. Both Harold Hardrada and Tostig did not live for very long after it. So according to Snorri Sturluson, a lone man had rode up to Harold Hardrada and Tostig before the battle in what is described as plainly mythical. It is a little bit ridiculous, I'll admit. Well, Sturluson says that he did not identify himself, but he spoke to Tostig and promised him the return of his earldom in return for his rebellion against Hardrada. Tostig wanted to know how much his brother Harold Godwinson would take from Hardrada in exchange for his trouble. The mysterious stranger replied, 7 feet of English ground, as he is taller than other men. You know what that means. He then returned to the Saxon host. Hardrada's admiration for the rider's boldness led Tostig to being asked who the rider was. Now, later on it was said that the mysterious rider was actually Harold Godwinson himself. Well, that's an interesting twist, isn't it? Probably didn't happen, though. But hey, don't let that ruin the fun. Either way, September the 12th, 1066, the Norman fleet sailed out from Normandy, William at the command. The fleet had to seek shelter in St. Valery-sur-Somme and wait for the wind to change due to the storms. A number of ships were unfortunately also sunk, so yes, once bitten, twice shy, I'm afraid. The Norman fleet had sailed for England then, a few weeks later, on September the 27th, and arrived the next day at Pevensey on the Strand of East Sussex. Harold's army had to travel 240 miles, that's almost 400 kilometers, to reach William, who had landed somewhere in southern England's Sussex region. Of course, you can imagine that after such a long march, people were very tired. I mean, almost 400 kilometers, 240 miles. That's almost as long as our grandparents used to walk to school every day. Harold positioned his army and hurriedly built earthworks there close to Hastings. The two armies fought a bloody battle at the Battle of Hastings, which was fought on October 14th at Senlac Hill, which is close to the modern-day town of Battle, which is, of course, named because of the battle. Creativity, very good. And so it was there, on that very field, where Harold Godwinson was killed, and his forces were routed, following 9 hours of fierce combat. His brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, were also removed from the picture during the war. Okay, so you've probably seen the painting, with Harold getting shot by the arrow. Well, that is another topic of considerable debate. Well, according to the Norman Chronicle, the Song of the Battle of Hastings, in which Guy, Bishop of Amiens, is said to have written soon after the battle, 4 knights, probably including Duke William, dismembered Harold's body and lanced him. Harold was killed by an arrow wound to the head, according to 12th century Anglo-Norman histories like Henry of Huntingdon's Historia Anglorum and William of Malmesbury's Gesta Regum Anglorum. You'll find William of Malmesbury coming up quite a lot if you're talking about this kind of time period. Harold was shot in the eye with an arrow, according to one report by Amatus of Monte Cassino called History of the Normans, and that was written 12 years after the Battle of Hastings. So that's pretty close in terms of time. But it is possible, though, that it was added at the beginning of the 14th century, because of the contradictory information in the sources regarding Harold's death. I guess modern historians have been pretty much unable to come up with a conclusive account without finding, well, they'd have to find his body, right? Something conclusive to really undermine or prove the theory. And good luck with that. Well, there is actually a figure holding an arrow that has struck his eye in a panel of the Bayeux tapestry that reads, literally, "Here King Harold is killed." On the other hand, it might have actually been a late 18th or even an early 19th century alteration to the tapestry, which I find very cheeky, because you're not meant to do that. Of course, some historians have questioned whether the panel shows two instances of Harold in the order of his death, or even if the man being shot in the head with the arrow is actually Harold at all. No, either way, usually regarded as Harold, the figure standing to the left of the central figure, followed by the figure lying to the right, nearly supine, being disfigured under a horse's hoofs, which is not a very nice way to go at all. Etchings produced in the 1730s using the tapestry show a standing figure alongside various objects. Only a dotted line indicating stitch marks can be seen in Benoit's sketch from 1729. This line does not exhibit any fletching and is longer than the arrow that is currently visible. The other arrows in the tapestry, however, are all fletched. Bernard de Montfaucon made the engraving in 1730, and it shows a solid line that looks like a spear being held overhand. Of course, you're far more likely to get killed by a spear than an arrow, I suppose. The standing figure that is shown with an arrow to the eye is held similarly to that same line. Now, in the tapestry there are also stitch marks that show where such a spear might have been removed. In 1816, the Society of Antiquaries of London tasked one Charles Stothard with making a replica of the tapestry. He included portions of the work that had been previously missing or damaged in his reproduction of the piece, along with his own conjectured representations. Well, this is the time when the arrow first appears. However, it's been proposed that extremely enthusiastic 19th century restorers once stitched an arrow into the supine figure, but that arrow was later taken off. Many people think that the figure with the arrow in his eye is actually Harold, because the name Harold is simply above it. Of course, that claim has generated its own share of controversy due to an examination of other tapestry examples that demonstrate figures that are identified by the visual center of the scene rather than the location of the inscription. It's also possible that both stories are accurate, and that the tapestry shows the mutilation and the eye wound in the chronological order in which they happened. Now, this would imply that Harold was actually mutilated after suffering the arrow to the face. Well, either way, it's not a very good way to go, isn't it? You wouldn't want it to happen to you, that's for sure. Well, what happens next? I'll leave you with a little account from William of Poitiers. It sheds a little bit of light on it. The two brothers of the king were found near him and Harold himself, stripped of all badges of honor. Could not be identified by his face, but only by certain marks on his body. His corpse was brought into the Duke's camp, and William gave it for burial to William, surnamed Mallet, and not to Harold's mother, who offered for the body of her beloved son its weight in gold. For the Duke thought it unseemly to receive money for such merchandise, and equally he considered it wrong that Harold should be buried as his mother wished, since so many men lay unburied because of his avarice. They said in jest that he who had guarded the coast with such insensate zeal should be buried by the seashore. So, that was the life of Harold Godwinson. But it leaves us with a bit of imaginative questioning, I think. Now, I always thought that if they didn't have to fight the Battle of Stamford Bridge, if he didn't have to go all the way up north to fight Harold Hardrada, then he would have had the energy, the men, and the morale to put up a much better fight at Hastings. Now, equally so, if it was, we have three rival claimants here, right? Could Hardrada have been fighting with William? There is that possibility too. Perhaps they would have met at York instead, or Hardrada may have made an attack all the way far south, towards the location of the Battle of Hastings. And then how would have that turned out? You must think that these kind of moments in history, they really change things. Especially having a Norman king who didn't even speak the native English tongue, was barely even interested in living in England, to be honest. Well, everything changed after that. The way that we speak now in English, it's not like how it used to be. Well, I suppose there's plenty of historical fan fiction that could be written in either way. Imagine if Hardrada had have taken the victory and taken the crown for himself. Perhaps our language would sound more like Norwegian. But what we are left now is a watered-down version of the original English, mixed in with lots of French and German. Of course, it got a lot more watered down later on with the great vowel shift that happened after the plague. But that's more of a linguistics video, and a topic for another day. Well, I hope you liked it. I enjoyed it. Poor old Harold Godwinson. Well, that is just the way it is. Now I'm going to thank the top-tier supporters: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Star Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, and Ryan. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next exciting video. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.